Welcome to The Crime Keeper, where we journey into the shadows of the past to uncover the true stories that echo through time. Stories where truth is stranger than fiction, where the darkest corners of history reveal the chilling depths of the human psyche. With every case, we peel back the layers of myth and media to illuminate the facts with sharp detail, historical context, and just the right touch of cinematic flair. And today's case. It's one that not only stunned an entire nation in the jazz-soaked heart of the 1920s, but also left its fingerprints on Hollywood for decades to come. We're talking about a crime so cold, so calculating, and so rooted in twisted philosophy that it became a blueprint for some of cinema's most unsettling tales. If you're a fan of Alfred Hitchcock, you might already feel the shadows lengthening. His 1948 classic Rope, a masterclass in tension and psychological manipulation, wasn't just a work of fiction. It was a direct reflection of this real-life horror. In Rope, two erudite young men strangle a peer and hide the body in plain sight, hosting a dinner party with the corpse stuffed inside a chest just feet away. Their motive? Not hatred, not revenge, but intellectual arrogance. A belief that they could get away with murder simply because they were too smart to get caught. Sound familiar? But let's be clear, while Rope offers a stylized, almost theatrical glimpse into this disturbing mindset, the true story is far more haunting. There were no camera cuts in real life. No artistic framing to soften the blow. Just a brutal, premeditated murder, fueled by ego, committed by two young men who believed they were above morality and above the law. Today, we go beyond the film reel and into the real. Into the minds of Leopold and Richard Loeb. Into a case that gripped a generation, forced America to reckon with the idea of evil in the educated elite, and left behind a legacy of legal, psychological, and cultural questions that still ripple through true crime today. Leopold and Richard Loeb weren't your typical criminals. They were, by all outward appearances, the golden boys of Chicago's elite. Born into families of immense wealth and social prestige, they were raised in sprawling mansions, educated at the finest institutions, and groomed for greatness. Theirs was a world of private tutors, foreign travel, and boundless intellectual opportunity. But somewhere along the way, brilliance twisted into arrogance, and curiosity curdled into something much darker. By the age of 19, Leopold was already considered a prodigy. He spoke 5 languages fluently, had published academic papers in ornithology, and was an avid reader of Friedrich Nietzsche. But it wasn't Nietzsche's poetic musings that fascinated him. It was the philosopher's concept of the Übermensch, the so-called Superman, an individual who transcends ordinary morality. Leopold believed, truly and deeply, that he was such a man. That his intellect made him untouchable. That the rules meant for average people simply didn't apply to him. Then there was Richard Loeb. Handsome, charismatic, and reckless. Less academically inclined, but more impulsively daring. He craved excitement, lived for risks, and found in Leopold a partner who could match his intensity and feed his delusions. Together, they formed a dangerous synergy, Leopold, the theorist and intellectual architect, Loeb, the bold executioner drawn to danger like a moth to flame. And together, they decided that the ultimate demonstration of their superiority would be to commit the perfect crime. Not for money, not for revenge, but to prove a point. A murder, random and precise, chosen for no reason other than its convenience, and its potential to go unsolved. That would be their masterpiece. Their victim? 14-year-old Bobby Franks. A bright, well-liked boy from a good family. Innocent, unassuming, and heartbreakingly close to home. He was Richard Loeb's own second cousin. That didn't stop them. In fact, it may have made Bobby more of a challenge, another variable in their sick equation. On May 21, 1924, they lured Bobby into a rental car under the pretense of giving him a ride. Inside that car, the mask came off. They struck him with a chisel and suffocated him. His death was brutal, swift, and meaningless to them, just a step in the plan. They then drove his lifeless body across the city, poured hydrochloric acid on his face and genitals in an attempt to conceal his identity, and stashed him in a culvert in a remote area of Wolf Lake. To cover their tracks, they mailed a typewritten ransom note to Bobby's parents, demanding $10,000 in cash. The goal wasn't the money, it was misdirection. Theater. But what they hadn't accounted for, in all their cold calculations, was that fate has a funny way of intervening. When investigators found Bobby's body, they also found something else. Small, almost inconsequential at first glance. A pair of eyeglasses. Not Bobby's. Someone else's. Unique. Rare. Custom-made. They belonged to Nathan Leopold. Sometimes, justice hinges not on grand revelations, but on the smallest of details. And in the case of Bobby Frank's murder, it was a single object, unassuming, delicate, and utterly damning, that would tear the mask off a so-called perfect crime. At the edge of the culvert where Bobby's body had been hastily hidden, investigators discovered a pair of eyeglasses. They weren't just any glasses. These were pince-nez, a rare, old-fashioned style that clipped onto the nose without earpieces. And even more telling, they were fitted with a very specific prescription, and an unusual hinge mechanism, that had only been manufactured for a handful of clients. In all of Chicago, only 3 such pairs had been sold. One of them belonged to Nathan Leopold. It should have been the detail they never overlooked. But blinded by arrogance, the 2 boys hadn't even realized Nathan's glasses had fallen from his coat pocket during the disposal of the body. That tiny oversight, an accessory, a mere tool for vision, was all it took to unravel their elaborate facade. As the detectives closed in, their so-called composure began to crack. Initially, Leopold offered a shaky alibi involving bird-watching with Loeb, an explanation that disintegrated under even mild scrutiny. And then, as the pressure mounted, the unthinkable happened. The prodigies, these 2 self-proclaimed supermen, cracked. Not over weeks or months, but days. They turned on each other almost immediately, each trying to minimize their role, each painting the other as the mastermind. The image of unity and intellectual superiority collapsed into petty finger-pointing and frantic confessions. It was over. The case quickly transformed from a murder investigation into a national obsession. Newspapers splashed the boys' privileged backgrounds and chilling motives across front pages. The American public was stunned, not just by the brutality of the crime, but by who had committed it. These weren't gangsters or drifters. These were society's sons. Educated, polished, and absolutely remorseless. Into the center of this storm stepped Clarence Darrow, the most renowned criminal defense lawyer in the country. A man known not only for his sharp mind, but for his passionate opposition to the death penalty. Darrow didn't take the case to claim their innocence. There was no room left for that. He took it to save their lives. His goal wasn't to deny the horror of what they had done, but to convince a judge that hanging 2 teenagers, no matter how monstrous their actions, would only perpetuate the cycle of violence. What followed was one of the most dramatic court cases in American history, a battle not just of law, but of philosophy, psychology, and public morality. While Alfred Hitchcock's Rope may have captured the essence of Leopold and Loeb's crime in a slick, stylish psychological thriller, it only scratched the surface of the horror that unfolded in reality. In Rope, the story is condensed into a single, suffocatingly tense dinner party, where the 2 young killers invite their friends over for a meal, all while concealing the body of their victim in plain sight. Hitchcock's cinematic genius adds layers of suspense and dramatic flair, turning the true crime into a voyeuristic dance of misdirection. But the truth? It wasn't nearly as elegant. It wasn't polished. It wasn't wrapped in a neat, suspense-filled bow. The real story was messier, colder, far more tragic. There were no slow zooms on darkened eyes, no dramatic piano keys playing as the guests chatted unaware. The reality of the crime was devoid of the glitz and glamour that Hollywood sometimes projects onto tragedy. There was no clever twist where everything neatly falls into place. Instead, there was a harsh, unforgiving unraveling. A group of people, parents, detectives, and eventually an entire nation, forced to confront the monstrous reality of what had happened. A murder so cold-blooded that even the wealth and privilege of Leopold and Loeb couldn't shield them from the consequences. And then, as the two young men, whose arrogance once led them to believe they were untouchable, were paraded into a courtroom, the full weight of their crime became undeniably clear. The trial, which played out before the eyes of an eager and fascinated public, gripped the nation like few events ever had. The media swarmed, the courtroom became a circus, and every detail of their lives, every shred of their twisted philosophy, was put on display for the world to see. This wasn't the carefully choreographed tension of Hitchcock's film. This was the raw, painful spectacle of two privileged boys who had lost their humanity, now facing the harsh light of reality. The courtroom drama that ensued was a fight not just for justice, but for the very idea of morality itself. Could these two young men, so steeped in intellectual arrogance, be redeemed? Or were they, as Darrow tried to argue, simply victims of their own delusions? In the end, the truth couldn't be concealed by the cleverness of a story, or the sophistication of a high society dinner. There was no fade to black, no easy escape for Leopold and Loeb. The brutal reality of their crime was there for all to see, and it would leave a scar on American consciousness that would never fully fade. So, what do you think? Were Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb merely victims of philosophy? Was it the dangerous allure of Nietzsche's ideas that warped their minds and led them down a dark path? Or were they simply cold-blooded killers, hiding behind intellect and privilege as an excuse for their actions? We want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, what's more terrifying in your eyes? A killer driven by uncontrollable rage, or one who is driven by ego, theory, and a dangerous sense of superiority? Which is more chilling to you, the mind that snaps, or the one that calculates? And hey, if you've been as fascinated by how true crime intersects with classic cinema as we are, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to The Crime Keeper, because here, we bring history's darkest dramas back to life, one case at a time. Whether it's a brutal murder that changed the course of a nation, or a twisted psychological thriller that left its mark on Hollywood, we're here to uncover it all. Don't miss out. Join us for the next deep dive into the criminal mind. Your seat at the table awaits. Leopold and Loeb believed they were gods among men. To them, the laws of society didn't apply. Their intellectual prowess, their wealth, their status, it all fed into their delusion that they could rise above the ordinary constraints of morality. They thought themselves untouchable, invincible, like players in a game with no real consequences. But justice, as it always does, is quiet, methodical, uncompromising. It operates in the shadows, often unseen, but always present. And in the end, no one, no matter how powerful, no matter how brilliant, is above the consequences of their actions. Richard Loeb's life was tragically cut short in 1936, when he was murdered by a fellow inmate in prison. It was a grim and fitting end for a man who had lived a life built on the false notion of superiority. He had thought he was above the law, but in the end, the law caught up with him in the most brutal of ways. Nathan Leopold, however, survived far longer. After serving 33 years for his role in the murder, he was paroled in 1958. But the world that once dazzled him, the world of high society, intellectual debate, and arrogance, had long since turned its back. Leopold lived out his final years in relative obscurity, far from the limelight he once so desperately craved. He was no longer the brilliant prodigy he had imagined himself to be, but simply another man, one whose past would forever haunt him. And in the end, what can we learn from the tragic saga of Leopold and Loeb? The lesson here is simple, yet profound. Intelligence, when untethered by empathy, is a dangerous weapon. These two young men were brilliant, yes, but their brilliance was twisted by a cold detachment from humanity. They saw themselves as superior, not as part of a greater whole. And in that detachment, they sealed their fate. Arrogance, too, can be the most fatal flaw of all. Leopold and Loeb believed that they could outsmart the world, that their intellect made them invincible. But it was their arrogance, driven by their sense of entitlement and their belief in their own superiority, that led them down a path from which there was no return.